My review of Knowledge and Decisions by Thomas Sowell. This is an article from my Medium blog by Spencer Antonio Marlen-Starr, originally published on August 3rd, 2023. This is a review I originally wrote on my Goodreads profile a while back of what I consider to be the greatest book written by a great economist and a great man, Dr. Thomas Sowell. I simply copied and pasted it here and then expanded upon it, including long quotes from the book. My review of the book. I have listened to the audio version of 10 or 11 books written by the economist Dr. Thomas Sowell, at least twice for each of them over the years, and I must say this is his magnum opus in my opinion. I consider myself a fairly intelligent person, and as someone who earned a bachelor's degree in economics, I like to think I'm fairly well versed in the subject covered in this book. However, it wasn't until my third time listening to the audio version of this book available on Audible that I was able to actually comprehend his analysis throughout it, because this is the most sophisticated, advanced, and precise of the 10 or 11 books written by Thomas Sowell which I have read. To be sure, this is an academic book. If you have never read any economics books or textbooks, or taken any economics courses, or never read any other books written by Dr. Thomas Sowell, this is not the first, second, third, or even fourth book of his to read. It is so rigorous and precise that once I finished listening to it for a third time 2 months ago, I did something I have never done before in my 9 years of using the Audible app to listen to audiobooks. I started it back over from the beginning immediately instead of moving on to another book. If you are an economist, a big fan of the field of economics, or follow the work of many economists, or are versed in the history of economic thought, you will be aware of the Austrian-born Nobel Prize-winning economist F.A. Hayek in his landmark 1945 paper published in the American Economic Review called The Use of Knowledge in Society. This book, Knowledge and Decisions by Thomas Sowell, is essentially a book-length and society-wide expansion on and application of the lessons explained in that paper. Hayek himself wrote a glowing review of this landmark book when it came out in 1980. Besides Hayek, the economist whose fingerprints can be found most often throughout this brilliant book, Armin Alchian, who is legendary among economists but not well known to the public at large. Sowell repeatedly draws on the paradigm put forth in Alchian's 1950 paper, Uncertainty, Evolution, and Economic Theory. This makes sense because this book was published in 1980, and Thomas Sowell was a colleague of Armin Alchian in the economics department of UCLA during the 1970s. Besides resting on a backbone of the Hayekian understanding of the use and role of knowledge in economies and societies more generally, and Alchian's evolutionary framing of economic issues and phenomena. The biggest comparative advantage of this book compared to other great books by other great economists is Sowell's insistence throughout the text to refer to political systems, social phenomena, and economic issues exclusively by uh, characteristics as dynamic processes, or as he as often puts it, their institutional mechanics rather than their hoped for goals. And for the record, Hayek reviewed this book in 1983, 3 years after it was published, for Reason magazine and called it the best book on general economics published in many years, and really sung its praises to a surprising degree for him. I gave this book 5 out of 5 Marlen-Starrs because 5 is the maximum amount I was allowed to rate it. If I could have given it 6 out of 5 stars, I would have. This is tied for my favorite book of all time, along with Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb. Some choice quotes from Knowledge and Decisions. This passage is from the preface to the second and most recent edition of the book, which was published in 1996. In one sense, it might seem that there has been a growing trend in the United States and in Western civilization generally toward greater individual freedom from both government control and social control. Words that could not have been used in public just a generation or so ago are now broadcast throughout the mass media. both still and motion pictures that would have been banned then are today not only widely available, but are even being shown to children in the public schools. Flouting convention has become almost a convention itself, and for critics of existing society, indignation has become a way of life. As with so many other seemingly revolutionary developments in history, however, the question must be raised whether there has been a net diminution of taboos or a substitution of new taboos and repressions for old. From the standpoint of a study of the social coordination of knowledge and the role of decision-making processes, further questions must be raised as to whether these new social trends represent better or worse ways of coping with the inherent inadequacies of human knowledge when making decisions. End of quote. I pondered the middle section of this paragraph and restated it in my own words, like so. Before one celebrates the erosion of old societal taboos, he should ask whether there has been a net reduction in the number of societal taboos still being actively enforced over all, or has merely been a substitution of an equal or possibly even a greater number of new taboos for the old. The following passage is again taken just from the preface. It's still just part of the appetizer of this great book. Quote, many representatives of the new orthodoxies question the very existence of the knowledge which is crucial to decision making. To them, tested knowledge is nothing more than, quote, socially constructed, unquote, beliefs which can be readily replaced by other beliefs, which they will construct. The many social verification processes which weed out failing notions and preserve validated knowledge thus disappear from the discourse, as if by sleight of hand, when ideas and practices are seen as merely constructed and thus capable of being deconstructed, whether in literature, law, or other fields. The apparent sophistication of this approach can be scrutinized with a physical example in order to avoid the distractions of ideological presuppositions. Eyesight is, in some sense, constructed, because it is not merely a matter of light entering the eye and traveling to the optic nerve. From these light patterns, the brain must construct a world and project it outward as something that we see. For example, it is not these light patterns themselves, but our presuppositions about perspective, which enable us to decide that the chair next to us, which looms much larger in our field of vision than the automobile across the street, is nevertheless not as big as the automobile. We know that dogs do not see the same world we do because they are colorblind, and that other creatures with different kinds of eyes, and creatures with sonar-like perception systems, such as bats, must construct their picture of the world from very different raw materials of the senses. But does any of this mean that what we see is merely a set of conventions, no more valid than an abstract painting or a vision to be conjectured up by the words of articulate writers or orators, or by psychedelic drugs? Would anyone walk into a lion's cage because both the lion and the cage, as we see them, are ultimately things constructed in our brains? More important, why not? Only because the verification processes so deftly made to disappear in theory could become very quickly, very brutally, and very agonizingly apparent. That is also the very reason why dogs do not run into a roaring flame, and why bats swerve to avoid colliding with a stone wall. All these differently constructed worlds are subjected to verification processes. All these creatures' worlds, like our own, are indeed perceptions, but they are not just perceptions. The position of the observer is indeed an integral part of the data, but it is not the only part of the data. The whole approach of knowledge and decisions is the antithesis of that of deconstructionism. From here, the prevailing theme is that there is an independent reality which each individual perceives only imperfectly, but which can be understood more fully with feedback that can validate or invalidate what was initially believed. This applied not only to physical reality, but to social realities. whose many ramifications may not all be understood by any given individual, but whose feedback nevertheless forces the decision maker to change course in spite of whatever predilections that decision maker may have. To take a trivial and non controversial example, the initial decision of the Coca Cola Company to change the flavor of their drink to what they thought the public would prefer was rescinded with embarrassing haste when the market response belied the company's expectations. Stock markets are likewise an ongoing economic referendum on what goods and services people do and do not want, often disappointing and punishing those who guessed wrong, even with the best professional advice available. End of very long quote. Obviously, my favorite part is where he adds, which they will construct. When I first encountered those who argue the most that most things in society are socially constructed to some degree, and therefore arbitrary to some degree, and therefore may be replaced with such and such, where such and such are outright constructions by the people speaking or writing and their ilk, I always thought the way they were trying to put that through smelt really fishy to me, but I was not able to articulate it the way Sowell was able to back in 1996. I am talking about my Intro to Sociology class at UC Irvine in 2017, by the way, so he was way ahead of the curve. The difference between the types of knowledge possessed by a sociologist and farmhand, according to Thomas Sowell. Quote, to say that a farm boy knows how to milk a cow is to say that we can send him out to the barn with an empty pail and expect him to return with milk. To say that a criminologist understands crime is not to say that we can send him out with a grant or a law and expect him to return with a lower crime rate. He is more likely to return with a report on why he has not succeeded yet, and including the inevitable need for more money, a larger staff, more sweeping powers, etc. In short, the degree of authentication of knowledge may be lower in the quote higher intellectual levels and much higher in those areas which intellectuals choose to regard as lower. A business which produces a product that the public will not buy in a sufficient quantity or at a high enough price to cover production costs will have its ideas validated in, or in this case, invalidated in a swift and painful process which must be heeded quickly before bankruptcy sets in. The results cannot be talked away, but in many intellectual areas, notably so-called social science, there is neither a swift nor a certain authentication process for ideas, and the only ultimate validation is whether the ideas sound plausible to enough people or to the right people. The stricter standards and independent, often conclusive evidence in the physical sciences cannot be generalized to intellectual activity as a whole, even though the aura of scientific processes and results is often appropriated by other intellectuals. End of quote. Why bureaucracies might not be as incompetent as we all think they are, according to Sowell. Quote, much criticism of incompetent bureaucracies implicitly assumes that those in the bureaucracy are pursuing the assigned goal but failing to achieve it due to lack of ability. In fact, they may be responding very rationally and ably to the set of incentives facing them. For example, government regulatory agencies are often very ineffective in controlling the industry or sector which they have a legal mandate to regulate. But it is a common pattern in such agencies for those in decision-making positions to 1. Earn far less money than comparable individuals earn in the regulated sector, and 2. After a few years' experience to move on to jobs in the regulated sector. In short, they are regulating their future employers. Under such a set of incentives, it is hardly surprising that decision makers in regulatory agencies approach those whom they are assigned to regulate with an attitude that is sympathetic, cooperative, and even protective. The only protection of the public interest built into the incentive structure are the penalties for blatantly illegal conduct, such as taking bribes to make a particular decision for a particular company at a particular time. but explicit bribes are seldom necessary in order to get the regulatory agency to adopt the general viewpoint of the regulated sector, in which many regulatory officials expect to make a more lasting and more lucrative career than is open to them in government. Morally, it is possible to deplore individual weakness or selfishness, but rationally there is little reason to expect a different outcome from a normal sample of people facing the same structure of incentives. Reform by throwing the rascals out seems less promising than reform by changing the structure of incentives facing whoever occupies individual decision-making positions. The diversity of personal tastes ensures that no given institution will become the answer to a human problem in the market. The need for food, housing, or other desiderata can be met in a sweeping range of ways. Some of the methods most preferred by some will be the most abhorred by others. Responsiveness to individual diversity means that market processes necessarily produce chaotic results from the point of view of any single given scale of values. No matter which particular way you think people should be housed or fed, or their needs met, the market will not do it just that way, because the market is not a particular set of institutions. People who are convinced that their values are best not only for themselves, but for others, must necessarily be offended by many things that happen in a market economy, whether those people's values are religious, communistic, white supremacist, or racially integrationist. The diversity of tastes satisfied by a market may be its greatest economic achievement, but it is also its greatest political vulnerability. Decision making through any kind of process involves costs created by the decision making process itself, quite aside from those costs created by the particular decisions reached. Achieving agreement or resolution of opposing views is never free, nor should these transactions costs, as economists call them, be thought of as minor incidental expenses. The transactions costs of choosing a new emperor of the Roman Empire often included tens of thousands of lives and the destruction of whole cities and surrounding countrysides in battles amongst contenders. The devotion of many rational and public spirited men of later times to the principle of royal succession, which might seem at first to be only an irrational special privilege, is more easily understood against an historical background of astronomical transactions costs in choosing national leaders. Even one who felt that a given king, or kings in general for that matter, had only average intelligence, or even somewhat below average intelligence, might reasonably choose to bear with royal succession if he felt that the likely differences in leadership were not worth the carnage involved in alternative political processes available at the time. End of long quote. Why it is a canard, or at least grossly misleading, to conflate the concept of freedom by asking where people having the freedom to things like healthcare, this is what philosophers and political scientists call positive rights, to the traditional concept of freedom in the West since the Enlightenment, namely freedom from state coercion or negative rights, as political philosophers and political scientists call them. Quote, when freedom is conceived of as a relationship among people, trade-offs of freedom for material goods, scientific progress, or military power, for example, become quite explicit, instead of being subsumed under a general expansion of freedom as sweepingly defined. The growth of decision-making powers of government may facilitate various specific forms of material progress, even if at the expense of material progress in general while reducing freedom. That trade-off needs to be made explicit. It is instead muddied over by those who define freedom as options, freedom to or positive rights, and who have many options to promise in exchange for our freedom. The options approach asks, what freedom does a starving man have? The answer is that starvation is a tragic human condition, perhaps more tragic than loss of freedom. That does not prevent these from being two different things. No matter what ranking may be given to such disagreeable things as indebtedness and constipation, a laxative will not get you out of debt, and a pay raise will not ensure regularity. Conversely, on a list of desirable things, gold may rank much higher than peanut butter, but you cannot spread gold on a sandwich and eat it for nourishment. The false issue of ranking things cannot be allowed to confuse questions of distinguishing things. End of quote. The important consequences of the fact that government bureaucracies face categorical mandates rather than incremental, that is, marginal trade offs in the presence of diminishing returns, which are ubiquitous. Quote, given categorical mandates and the law of diminishing returns, it is virtually inevitable that government agencies would eventually end up doing things which seem irrational as isolated decisions. The aggrandizement familiar in all kinds of human activities, from the dressing of babies to the spread of multinational corporations, applies as well to government agencies. But where other expansions are constrained not only by budget limits, but also by incremental returns from other lines of activity, government agencies with mandated activities have every incentive to push those particular activities as far as politically possible, even into regions of negative incremental returns to society. This is especially apparent in preventative activities designed to contain various evils, as those evils are successively reduced either by the agency's own activity or by other technological or social developments. The agency must then apply more activity per residual remaining unit of evil, just in order to maintain its current employment and appropriations level. If the agency is supposed to fight discrimination against minorities, it must successively expand its concept of what constitutes discrimination and what constitutes a minority, as the level of discrimination in society falls on average over time. Urgent tasks such as securing basic civil rights for blacks ultimately give way to activities designed to get equal numbers of cheerleaders for girls' high school athletic teams. A non governmental organization such as the March of Dimes could, as it did after conquering polio, turn its attention to other serious diseases. But if it had had a government mandate strictly limited to polio, it would have little choice but to continue into such activities as writing the history of polio, collecting old polio posters, etc., while children were still dying from birth defects or other maladies. The point here is not that the leaders of the March of Dimes were either more intelligent or morally superior to the leaders of government agencies. The point is that a non governmental organization subject to feedback from donors or customers has incentives and constraints that lead to institutional decisions more attuned to rational social trade offs. End of quote. Another quote which makes a point made in the above quotation, which is from 3 pages before it in the same chapter of the book, is much more concise. Quote, a more rationalistic plan of gathering all like activities into an agency devoted solely to that activity means, in fact, creating incentives to keep that activity alive as long as possible and to pursue it as far as possible with little or no regard for social costs and benefits. The costs of duplication at a given time must be weighed against these longer run costs of consolidation. End of quote. In the 2 paragraphs below, Sowell makes the greatest argument in favor of equal opportunity laws compared to affirmative action laws I have ever seen by a country mile. Quote, the ineffective record of affirmative action policies is in sharp contrast with the record of equal opportunity laws in the years immediately preceding, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and before quotas in 1971, black income as a percentage of white income rose sharply, with blacks in white collar occupations also rising, along with rising proportions of blacks in skilled and professional jobs. One reason for the difference was the different set of incentives presented by the two policies. Equal opportunity laws provided penalties for specifically proven discrimination. Affirmative action laws penalized numbers that disappointed administrative agencies and made defenses against rebuttable presumptions costly and uncertain. It might appear at first that affirmative action penalties costs were stronger, higher, but not when costs are recognized as opportunity costs. The difference between following one course of action rather than another. The general unattainability of many quotas means that penalties fall equally on discriminatory employers and non-discriminatory employers. A discriminatory employer therefore has little to gain by becoming a non-discriminatory employer when the characteristics of the target population, age, education, etc., ensure that he will be unable to fill quotas anyway. Moreover, the ease with which a discrimination case can be made makes minorities and women more dangerous employees to have in terms of future prospects of lawsuits if their subsequent pay, promotions, or other benefits do not match those of other employees or the expectations of administrative agencies. As in the case of other groups with special rights, as noted in Chapter 5, these rights have costs to the recipients themselves. In short, affirmative action provides opposing incentives to hire and not hire minorities and women. It is not surprising that it has been less effective than equal opportunity laws, which provide incentives in only one direction. End of quote. A fascinating paragraph which includes both a takedown of the lazy way the concept of privilege is used all too often and the concept of the self-made man. Quote, in addition to the situation in which morality becomes counterproductive with respect to its own set of values, it may also become counterproductive by its effects on other values. For example, preoccupation with the morality of individual privilege may lead to ignoring important social considerations that are also involved. The question may be asked, what has a particular individual ever done to deserve the wealth, privilege, and power of being king? The answer usually being nothing, when the more weighty social question may be the costs and benefits of monarchy as compared to whatever realistic political alternatives exist at a given time and place. In less extreme cases where the individual has made some contribution to his own good fortune, the question may still be asked whether it was enough to justify his advantages, when again the larger question may be whether there are institutional alternatives which would produce as good social results for others and for society as a whole. The fortunate individual himself may tend to answer with the same moral framework as the critic and depict himself as deserving, perhaps even regarding himself as a self-made man, to use an incredibly naive and arrogant expression. But the social issue may be systemic rather than individual, and preoccupation with morality can be a distraction from considering that larger issue. End of quote. And in this quote, Sowell explains why markets are not a meritocracy and why that's a good thing. Rather, they are what I call a productocracy. Quote, the fact that one person's productivity may be 1,000 times as valuable as another's does not mean that one person's merit is 1,000 times as great as another's. Productivity and merit are very different things, though the two things are often confused with one another. Moreover, an individual's productivity is affected by innumerable factors besides the efforts of that individual, being born with a great voice being an obvious example for a singer or a voice actor. Being raised in a particular home with a particular set of values and behavior patterns, living in a particular geographic or social environment, merely being born with a normal brain rather than a brain damaged during the birth process can make enormous differences in what a given person is capable of producing. More fundamentally, Third parties are in no position to second guess the felt value of someone's productivity to someone else, and it is hard to even conceive how someone's merit could be judged accurately by another human being who never walked in his shoes. An individual raised in terrible home conditions or terrible social conditions may be laudable for having become an average decent citizen with average work skills as a shoe repairer, while someone raised from birth with every advantage that money and social position can confer may be no more laudable for becoming an eminent brain surgeon. But that is wholly different from saying that repairing shoes is just as valuable to others as being able to repair maladies of the brain. To say that merit may be the same is not to say that productivity is the same, nor can we logically or morally ignore the discrepancy in the relative urgency of those who want their shoes repaired versus those in need of brain surgery. In other words, it is not a question of simply weighing the interest of one income recipient versus the interest of another income recipient while ignoring the vastly larger number of other people whose well being depends on what these individuals produce. End of quote. Edit from October 11th, 2023. All of these quotations came from a very large Google Doc that I put together in a different article. This is the end of this article. Thank you for listening.